argument, and all counsel may continue.
Ms. Violet, I know that we talked about victims of abuse and how in your practice you've seen them not file police reports or not tell the doctors what actually happened. Have you ever seen situations of what happens when these victims of abuse come to trial to testify?
It's approach.
Ms. Violet, in your practice, have you spoken with many women victims of abuse?
Yes, I have.
And you said that you've counseled these women as well, is that right?
Yes, I have.
And in speaking with them, have they talked to you about whether or not they're able or have been willing to make police reports or report their abuser to the police?
Yes, they have.
And have they talked to you about whether or not they have been willing to seek medical treatment when their abuser has harmed them in some way?
Yes, they've talked to me about that.
And have they talked to you about when they've been called to testify? About,
yes.
Is that a yes? Okay.
I'm sorry.
And when they talk to you about these things, what do they say about police reports?
Many of the women don't make police reports. Some of the ones that do change their minds when the police actually come out, and they might change the story if they've called 911. They may come back. Some of the women actually follow through. It sort of depends on where they are in that whole progression.
Of the relationship?
Of the relationship. But some of the women absolutely follow through with the police report.
And then have they talked to you about, if they followed through with the police report, have they talked to you about what happens if they're called to testify against their abuser?
Yes. Many of them recant. I think we have about, this is what I've been told by the court, that there are about 80%.
Sustained.
Have you worked with the courts before?
Yes, I have.
And when you work with the courts, what have you done?
Well, we had a domestic violence court in Long Beach.
Yes.
So the judge would meet with us on and off. I have consulted on some cases. I'm not sure, are you talking about with the...
Well, in order to have knowledge about, you were going to give us, I think, a number or some sort of what happens when
right.
women recant. How do you have that knowledge?
I have that knowledge because I've talked not only to people who run battered women's shelters, but also because I know some of the judges, or I knew some of the judges. We had a domestic violence court, and the judge is in Sedona now. She moved, and so we don't have that court anymore. But when we had it for 8 years. And they gave us information about what they saw, as did the shelters talk about what they had seen, and the victim advocates, because they're victim advocates in the court.
And then that information plus you speaking with these women yourself, right?
Yes.
And so what happens when these women get to court? You said they recant. What does that mean?
It means that oftentimes, and I would just like to say that frequently there's a long period of time between when a case is filed and when it gets to court. And so it might be a month, it could be 2 months before it actually gets into the court process. And during that time, if the couple stays together, many of them have reconciled. So you could...
So what happens when a couple reconciles then, with regard to the woman wanting to testify?
She doesn't want to testify because she doesn't want her partner to lose his job, or she doesn't want that on the record. And in California, there are a lot of fees associated with proceeding. There's a Penal Code 273.5, which is called corporal injury to a spouse. And if you plead nolo contendere, that you're not contesting it, or you are found guilty of 273.5, you have to do 52 weeks in a batterer's intervention program, a minimum of 52 weeks. You have to pay a fine to a battered women's program. You have to pay court fines for going through the court process. You have to do community service, and depending on what you do, depends on how much community service you have to do. And you also... you're on probation for 3 years. Can be reduced. You can file to have it reduced to 2 years, but you're on probation for a period of time. During that 1 year period, you also have to come back to court every quarter with a court report from your program to show, what you're doing and how you're progressing in that program.
And so how does that affect women, whether they recant or not?
It affects the family financially. It also affects the women depending on how angry the men are that they have to go through this process. And in my group, some of the men are very angry and blaming their partners for being stuck in court, being stuck in a program for a while, that sort of thing. But beyond that, for many of the men, there's a relief in being in the program, actually. But they still have to pay fines. They still have to pay fees for the group every week. And in California, we do a sliding scale, which means we have to serve people on a range of incomes. So there's usually an opportunity for somebody to get help and to be able to afford it. But it is financially sometimes a burden on the family to go through that.
And so how often, based on all the knowledge you have with regard to the women you've seen and speaking with the judges and working with the domestic violence program, how often do these women recant?
There's the estimate's about 80% of the time.
Okay. So even if they're able to get to the point where they're able to make a report and not change their mind when the police come, once they get to court, 80% of the time these women are actually taking it back? That's
the estimate that I've been given. The other thing I would say is that for some of the women, that the court process has been very difficult for them, and they don't feel that they've gotten supported when they've, for them, stuck their necks out. And so the ability for them to then go forward and push or to report a second time is diminished because depending on what happens the first time.
Does that go back to the feeling that an abuse victim might have that no one's going to believe her if she reports it?
It goes back to not only feeling believed, but feeling blamed. Because adult female victims are oftentimes blamed. Child victims are seen as helpless child victims. but adults are oftentimes, their victimization is not recognized in the same way, and they are seen as more culpable. So there's a lot of judgment, and it depends on how you feel you're treated in the court, how you feel you're treated by the original police officers that come out. And in many cities, there's a domestic violence unit, and people are specially trained, and they go out and they have what are called DART teams, domestic abuse response teams, and they actually go out and really take an interview and do that kind of thing and give resources to people. But if there are children involved, they also will send out a child abuse worker to respond with the kids. So if there are children involved, they have to send somebody out. So they're trying to address this in a more holistic way, so there's more support for families or individuals where there's domestic violence.
Okay. When you have someone coming to your men's group, joining your men's group, do you do some sort of an intake or an interview with them?
Yes, I do.
And what do you do? Who do you interview?
In my groups, I do something that's unusual, and it's because of the work I did in the shelter. Because I worked in the shelter, I knew more of the whole story initially, because I would have the women and children in the shelter, and I knew what happened to them. And sometimes we'd have medical records or police records, but we'd also have the women and children that were interviewed. So when I'd do my initial assessment with the men who were in relationship to those women, oftentimes the stories were very, very different. And so I thought it's very important for me to be able to do my work well and to really have a picture of what's going on and sort of assess a level of dangerousness. It's important for me to be able to interview the victim. So what I do is, if there is no protective order and the couple is still together, I invite the victim to come into the intake, but I see them separately. So I get, and if the victim does not want to come in, if the survivor does not want to come in, then I try to do an interview over the phone, because I want to get a bigger picture about what's going on, and I generally will not get it from the person who's coming into my program, because there's a lot of shame attached to telling me, about what happens. Actually, Lenore Walker used to say, the old saying, if there are two stories, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Lenore would say, if there are two stories and there's domestic violence, the truth is worse than either of them, because everybody's minimizing and denying. So even in that kind of a situation, I find that people play down what's going on.
So do you find that with the men who are coming in to ask you for help, that they play down what they've done or what's going on?
Yeah, for instance, I might have somebody, I'll ask a question about substance abuse, or drugs or alcohol, a problem in your family. And that's not where I start, but that's a question that I will ask. And one of the men said, no, we're social drinkers and we have, a couple martinis at night. And so I asked his partner, his wife, the same thing. And I said, if are drugs or alcohol, a problem in your family? And she said, absolutely. And I said, well, what's a problem, drugs or alcohol? She said, alcohol. And I said, why is that a problem, or why is that a problem for you? And she said, well, because he says we have one or two drinks a night, but his drinks are like in a vat. So when we have one or two drinks, it's like he has 3 drinks for every one. So it's like he's having 6 martinis instead of 3.
So does that give you a bigger picture when you're interviewing both?
It absolutely gives me a bigger picture.
And when you're interviewing the woman or the victim of abuse, do you find that person tends to minimize what's actually happening in the home?
Most of the time, the women are protective of the men that they're with, and they are very cautious about telling me. For instance, I'm a mandated reporter, so if they report child abuse, I have to report it. So I tell them the limits of my confidentiality, that these are the things that I'm going to have to report. I have to report child abuse if that's occurring, and I have to report a danger to self or others. So if there's an imminent threat, so if somebody comes into the office and says, I'm going to, seriously injure or hurt somebody, I have to do something about that. So I tell them the limits of my confidentiality, and then we talk. And it's it's very conversational. I don't have a lot of papers and fill things out. I try to just have a conversation with people. But I ask them questions. I ask them both the same kinds of questions to sort of see if there's a great difference in the stories. Because if there's a big difference in the stories, I've got a bigger problem. And if the stories match up a little bit, it's usually because both people are feeling like they can tell the truth a little more. And there's not as much shame attached or something, like they're able to do that.
Okay. Do you ever counsel couples together if they're in a domestic violence relationship?
I will not. I can't think of domestic violence couples I've counseled together for a few reasons. One is that, first of all, when I do an intake, even in couples counseling, I separate people so I can hear two different versions, whatever they're going to tell me about what's going on in their lives, because I never know if somebody's referring to me for domestic violence or for couples counseling. I don't know. And so I separate couples so I get more of a picture of what's going on. And then when I bring people back together, we can talk about what might be a good strategy, what might be a good way to work, what might be a good referral if they need a referral, that sort of thing. But if it turns out that they're coming in and he's going to, participate in my group, I'm definitely not going to. First of all, it would be a conflict to counsel them together. But if there's domestic violence, safety is an issue that we look at very seriously. So the safety of the survivor is really important. If we bring them together in a couples counseling situation, we actually don't know what happens when they go home if it's contentious in that situation. We don't know what we could be, sort of generating in that situation. So safety reasons. The second thing is that when there's a situation where one person feels like the bad guy, they usually feel like their partner is a better person than they are. And if they don't know how to make that level, the only thing they know how to do is level the playing field. So if you're leveling the playing field, what happens is if you leave and you're in couples counseling is you remember what the therapist has said about your partner and not what they've said about you. So, doing couples counseling for me means that there has to be some kind of balance in the relationship so you don't have a good guy, bad guy situation going on. And the third...
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to, if there's a third thing, I was going to talk about something else.
Okay. And the third reason I don't do couples counseling is because if I want somebody to change in a domestically violent situation, I want a perpetrator to change, I can't continue to confront that person in front of the person that he or she has hurt because they'll never feel good enough about themselves to take responsibility for what they've done or to even look at it. So it's like continually shaming somebody in front of somebody that they've hurt. So they're better off doing separate things.
Okay. All right. And you said you talked about the leveling the playing field. When you're interviewing these people, do you look for that balance of power that you've talked about?
I absolutely look for a balance of power. And I ask questions. I ask some questions that I almost ask all the time. And sometimes they go a different way because the people I'm working with are different. But, for instance, I usually ask people why they're there. What brings you here? What is the situation that brings you there? Sometimes there's a very different story even in that situation, but I want to get both people's perspective about what's brought them there. And I ask them if they like each other. Yeah, they're separate at this time. So I ask them, do you like your partner? Oh, I love my partner. I said, I didn't ask if you loved your partner. Do you like your partner? Is your partner your friend? Because I want to see sort of what the condition of the relationship is. Do you like this person? Do you respect them? I usually ask them if what they do, how they handle conflict. When they get upset with each other, how do you handle it? If they, I ask them if they've ever laid hands on each other. Because if you ask if there's pushing or slapping or grabbing, you'd have to ask each thing. If they tell me they've laid hands on each other, I can ask them what happened and how that happened. I ask them if they ever call each other names when they argue. And one of the things I want to see is what they think is normal, what they think is okay, what they feel they're entitled to do when they have an argument with each other. I generally ask them if they've ever threatened their partners. Do you ever threaten to leave? Do you ever threaten to, in any kind of a way, have you ever threatened to do physical harm? I find out that kind of information. I ask them about family of origin kinds of things. And this is really important because what I find is that I get so much more information from the survivor than I do from the perpetrator, even on these issues. And so when I ask, for instance, I had a young man and a young woman in, and I asked him about his family, and he told me that he came from, a family that wasn't very close, but he made it sound like it was a fairly normal family, but his mother had died when he was young, and didn't describe a lot with that family. When I interviewed his wife, she said, "Did he tell you what happened to him when he was 6?" And I said, "Well, I can't tell you what he said, but you can tell me whatever you want to tell me." And she said, "Well, when he was 6 years old, he was sitting on the couch with his mom, with his dad and his brother, and they were watching a movie. And his mother came in, and she just looked at the family, and then she left and went into the bedroom, and 2 shots rang out in the bedroom. And nobody ever got off the couch to see what happened until the commercial. And when they went in, his mother had shot herself." Now that tells me a lot about this man's life that I would not have known had I not brought both people in. So I get a much better picture all the way around. I can also find out about targets of abuse. It sort of, do you, ever get in fights outside of your family kind of thing, information about that. Sometimes I find out if somebody has a criminal record. There are just lots of different ways to get information with this.
And ultimately, does that help you then, once you start figuring out, if a man's coming into your men's group, does that ultimately help you to figure out where you need to go with him?
It does. It helps me to figure out, it's not one size fits all. It's sort of like you have to tailor what you're doing to the person that's in the room with you. And so without breaching anybody's confidentiality, you can do that. For instance, I had a young man who was very jealous and used to interrogate his girlfriend and do lots of, different things like that. Well, I don't say to him, "Well, your girlfriend told me you're jealous," but what I can talk to him is, I can talk about, for instance, in group that night, we might talk about non-physical ways of controlling somebody. And we can talk about the ways those things happen and make that more specific to that person or, but generalize it to the group.
Okay. We talked a little bit about the cycle of violence. Is that something, which is something that Lenore Walker created, is that right?
Yes, Lenore Walker developed that concept.
And I think you said that was in 1979?
Yes.
Is the cycle of violence, is that idea, is that still used today, or is there any controversy about it?
It's not used as much today, although a lot of victims of domestic violence really resonate with it. It's not used as much because there's controversy about the honeymoon phase, because over time, a lot of survivors don't get a honeymoon. And so the honeymoon can simply be, and I'm using honeymoon in quote, it can simply be the absence of aggression, and it feels like a honeymoon because nothing really bad's happening. So the terminology is controversial.
since Ms. Walker has written her book in 1979, has there been a lot of research since that time adding on to the ideas and the knowledge we now have about domestic violence?
There's a lot of research, and there's people that specialize in working with victims of domestic violence, and have written on victims and responses of victims. And there's a book, 2 books right now that are very good with looking at non-physical violence. One's called The Verbally Abusive Relationship by Patricia Evans, and one's called The Emotionally Abusive Relationship, and that's by Beverly Engel. So there's one that Evan Stark just did I think about 4 years ago, called Coercive Controlling Behaviors. That's really about coercion in relationship without having to use physical violence, but using purely psychological abuse and verbal abuse. And
what you're describing, the later research that's been done, it makes it sound as though Ms. Walker's research was based on physical violence only. Is that what you mean?
actually, she had physical, verbal, and sexual, I believe, in the book. It's been so long since I read it. My memory's a little, but Lenore talked about sexual violence, she talked about physical violence, and she talked about psychological. She talked about psychological abuse, too. In her book, she talked about really extreme forms. So a lot of people that we worked with didn't connect with it because they thought, well, that's not who I am, that's not who my partner is, because it was so extreme. There were really extreme cases. So we had a lot of victims of domestic violence who didn't think they were victims of domestic violence because they didn't fit in these extreme categories, or extreme descriptions, I should say.
Okay, I want to ask you some questions about what you know about the history of battered women. So and not like history as in school, but I mean history. If you have a woman that you're counseling, do you want to know about her history as well?
Her childhood?
Yes, her childhood.
I absolutely work with people's childhood history because what you see is sort of compound trauma. If you've got somebody who's been abused as a child and then grows up, maybe has been assaulted as a teenager or something, and then goes into an abusive relationship, there's a lot of vulnerability that comes from multiple trauma. So the other thing that we see is, and we looked at this when we looked at the research on battered women, that there was no consistency in the history of battered women. In other words, there were women from very healthy families. There were women from moderately healthy families, women from good families, women from very abusive families. There was the full range of women represented. So there was no consistency in the history of battered women, unlike with perpetrators, there's more consistency.
So with perpetrators, there's more consistency. With the more violent or traumatic a childhood, the more likely they are to become a batterer? Am I saying that correctly?
The more violent their history, or actually children tend to be affected even at low levels of domestic violence. So there's effects on children, and it depends on the resiliency of the child, the personality of the child. There's a lot of factors. If they have another family member they can count on, if there's community organization, there's a lot of compounding factors. But with perpetrators of domestic violence, they don't have to come from the worst abuse, but they are generally what are called exposed to domestic violence. Okay. So the new terminology are children exposed to domestic violence.
Children exposed, okay. And versus when we talk about women who are in abusive relationships or who are being abused, is that what you're talking about, that you see them come from all different types of families?
Yes, they don't have to come from abusive families to be abused.
Is there any research that talks about what happens if they come from an abusive family versus a healthy family? Is there any difference at all then? I don't know about research on that. I haven't seen research on that. What we have with that is just a lot of talking to each other in the field about that. And what we tend to see anecdotally
is that women who come from chronic abuse tend to repeat abusive relationships more frequently, and that women who come from basically healthy families tend to learn more from that situation, tend to leave more distance between relationships, and tend to be less likely to repeat.
Less likely to go into another abusive relationship, you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there, in the women that you've treated regarding either psychological abuse or physical abuse, is there something that women universally have been telling you about psychological or emotional abuse?
Women generally say that psychological and verbal abuse are worse for them than physical. Part of that is because there's usually a greater distance between episodes of physical abuse, and the psychological and psychological, emotional, verbal abuse tend to create the mood in the relationship, but it also is happening more frequently. So, there's articles on psychological, emotional abuse being mutilation of the soul, for instance. There's an article on that. But they generally will tell you that that's terrible for them.
And is it problematic, or do you find that psychological abuse can be subtle versus physical abuse? You know it when it's happening to you.
Yes, I mean, one thing about physical abuse is if somebody hits you, you can say, I got hit. If somebody says something to you and you're not quite sure, you feel like you've been stung, but you can't exactly explain why you feel like you've been stung. And then, of course, there's much more obvious psychological abuse too, but there's very subtle psychological abuse where people will say, sort of things you could take more than one way, but there's an edge to it. You know that it means something other than the nice way.
Is that what you were talking about earlier about the switching the perceptions, that the person, I think you gave us the example of the person getting hired. The partner comes home and says, hey, I got a new job, and oh, they must be hiring anybody.
Yeah.
And then he explains himself to say, oh, no, you just misunderstood me.
Right.
So is that an example of subtle psychological or emotional abuse?
That's an example of it. It could be anything. It could be, and once again, you're looking at a context, and you're not looking at an isolated situation. So I'm not talking about when somebody says, that dress makes you look fat. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about somebody who might say repeatedly, wow, are you gaining weight? Well, you look great. I don't care if you gain weight.
So it's
they can go on. They can say things like, I thought anybody would be able to figure that out, and then laugh about it. Or they call you a name and then laugh about it. Oh, I didn't mean that. There's so many ways that people can psychologically abuse, but what happens and what's important about it is that it becomes a mood in the relationship. It's not something that somebody says and then they don't say it again. It's something where there's a consistency in the treatment. There's a consistency in the way someone is treated.
Okay. And does that make it more difficult with that subtlety? Does that make it more difficult then for somebody to either understand that it's happening or report it or tell somebody else?
It absolutely makes it difficult because it's hard to tell somebody, well, somebody I love said something to me and I'm not sure if they meant it, or they said this to me, and somebody would say, well, anybody could say that. But it's the repetition. It's not saying that it doesn't have to be the same thing, but it's the repetition that creates the mood, that creates the belief that says, this is who I am. This is what the person I love actually thinks of me. This is how they think I ought to be treated. This is what they think should be said to me.
And incidentally, does that have more impact on somebody when it's somebody that we love who tells us these things versus somebody that we don't know?
Yes, absolutely it does. I mean, it's not fun to hear things about who you are from people you don't know. But I do public speaking, and so, you know, sometimes I get an evaluation that's not great. And overall. And when I look at that, I think, well, gee, I got these others and they're all good. And this person doesn't know me. And if they make constructive criticism, that's great, you know, and I can look at it. But if they're just saying something to sort of be mean, you know, it doesn't feel good, but they don't know me. They're not my family. They're not the people who I respect and care about their opinion like that. I mean, I care what people who are close to me think. Most of us care about what our friends and our family, we care about what they think about us. And so when somebody who loves us is tearing us apart, I mean, I don't think there's anything that hurts much worse than that.
Can we talk about the history of the abusive person for a second?
Sure.
And I know we've talked about, well, are there common risk markers?
The only common risk marker is exposure, because even when they look at things, they try to look at behaviors that, you know, people are jealous or people are threatening or whatever. You know, there's such a range with that behavior, but there's also a range in the level of what people do. There's a range in their childhood histories. So I'm not sure.
So as well, we've talked about the common risk marker. In other words, being somebody who's coming from a traumatic childhood or a violent childhood.
Objection, we have an order, if we may approach, please.
You may. may continue.
Let's talk about the children who are growing up in these homes, and that's what I was saying, is that we've discussed children who grow up in an abusive family. Do these children always turn out to have problems or turn out to be abusive themselves?
We'd actually have no way of knowing that because we don't have everybody in our programs, but I would just say this, that if you grow up...
Sustained.
Do you know, do you have knowledge with regard to when, depending on the child's personality, does that make a difference?
Same issue we discussed.
I'm asking if she has knowledge.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take the evening recess. The court has a matter tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, so I'm going to ask that you return at 10:45, and we will try to start promptly at that time. So 10:45 tomorrow morning. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice evening. You are excused. Record will show the jury has left the courtroom. You may step down. Counsel, could I see you in the hallway, please, before you leave for the day?